Hey folks, it's Miss Sinclair for AP World History Modern. Today we are starting Unit 6. Unit 6 looks at the consequences of industrialization. So we are beginning by looking at the motives for imperialism. So what comes to mind when you think of the word empire? What images? Is it history? Is it civilizations? Is it the evil empire in Star Wars? When you hear the word empire, what comes to mind? Today, like I said, we will be looking at the motivation for imperialism. So, Unit 6 looks at the consequences of industrialization between 1750 and 1900. So our unit objective, this is the objective we're going to be working towards with every lecture, is you will be able to explain the relative significance of the effects of imperialism. Our objective for today's lecture, however, aligns with topic 6.1 out of the AP course description, rationales for imperialism from 1750 to 1900. That means you will be able to explain how ideologies contributed to the development of imperialism. Okay, let's start talking about this new imperialism. First off, when we talk about imperialism and colonization, it's important to remember there are essentially two waves of this. The first wave will happen in the 16th century primarily, and it will be done by Spain and Portugal and Britain. This is, of course, going to be the colonization of the Americas. Our second wave of colonization will happen in the 19th century, so the 1800s. And this time, Africa and Asia will be significantly impacted. By this point, our first wave of colonies have gotten their own independence. So imperialism is the policy of strengthening a country's power into an empire through the military and diplomatic domination of other parts of the world. These regions we consider to be colonies. So 19th century Western imperialism is a direct result of the Industrial Revolution. They have more money, they have superior technology, and we know that Europe has always spent a lot of their technological energy on developing weapons. Remember how we've talked about in the past how Europe spent a lot of the medieval period just fighting each other, whereas other parts of the world, the Middle East, China, India, are being governed by large empires, right? So you don't have as much regional infighting. European nations will use increased military superiority to compete for raw materials to power their mechanized industries and new systems of transportation. So not only will the Industrial Revolution provide the means of how to conquer these new regions, it will also provide some of the motivation. You need raw materials to create using the factories, right? You need coal, you need iron, but it will also provide new markets to sell your materials that you are producing. So the British Empire will violently pursue the obtainment of colonies from the safety of England, right? They're safely ensconced on their own little island, and yet they will aggressively and violently seek colonies more than anyone else. So the British Empire will be achieved through the subjugation of native peoples who lacked the technological advancements to withstand British military power, right? If you are still fighting using swords or spears, hand weapons, it's hard to come up against a machine gun. So of our European colonizers, the British will be the most aggressive and the largest, which is pretty astonishing when you consider it's a tiny island in the North Sea. So we have sort of this scramble for colonies. The main areas for colonization are India, Africa, and Southeast Asia. In the early 1800s, Britain will be really dominant overseas. By the late 1800s, Belgium, France, Germany, and the US will have joined the scene and have large colonial empires as well. So all of this stems in part from internal European rivalries. We are seeing these internal rivalries play out in non-Western territories. This is nothing new, right? Why did France help the United States in the American Revolution? Because France wanted to stick it to Britain, right? It had nothing to do with the US. It had nothing to do with, the belief in our movement. No, it was a way to undermine your historic enemy. The same thing here. We are going to see that part of the competition for resources and land on an international scale is simply the European rivalries playing out beyond European borders. So we see increasing questions about political authority will eventually lead to anti-colonial movements, and national identities at this time will be based on religion, social customs, and territory. So nationalism is something that's really growing during the 19th century to the point where it will come to a head and explode into World War I. So states who already had colonies will strengthen their control over those colonies. So what are our main colonial types? Well, you have sort of tropical colonies where a few Europeans will rule many indigenous peoples, right? So think the Congo in Africa, or India, or the island of Java, right? In the Congo, a few Belgians will govern and oppress thousands of Africans, right? Think about how huge the Indian subcontinent is, and yet the British East India Company, a corporation, will take control. Or the island of Java. Indonesia is one of our most populous countries in the world today, and the island of Java had lots of people back then too, and yet a small Dutch population is able to govern. So you have tropical colonies where the goal here is essentially just exploitation of natural resources. This is different from settler colonies or settlement colonies. And of those settler colonies, there's sort of two types. First are our white dominion. These would be essentially Canada and Australia. An example of a white dominion settler colony is when Europeans settle the colony permanently to inhabit most of the region. So in Canada, frankly, in the US, in Australia, what we see is Europeans arrive, heck, in Argentina, in Chile, Europeans arrive, they decimate the native population, and then repopulate this land with Europeans, right? So that's a white dominion colony. Or you have contested settler colonies. These are going to be places where you have conflict between the indigenous population and the growing white population, European settlers. So with settlement colonies, you have Europeans moving and living in these colonies permanently. With white dominion colonies, they repopulate the land after decimating the native population. With contested colonies, you have conflict between the new white settlers and the indigenous peoples. Examples of this would be New Zealand with the Maori people, South Africa, that's a huge one, and even Hawaii. In all cases, especially as Europeans start to make contact with isolated Pacific islands, they will bring the epidemic diseases with them as well. So we have changes in Hawaii because of the increase of Asian indentured servants on Hawaiian plantations owned by Americans. We see a similar situation in Hawaii that occurred with the arrival of Columbus in the Americas. So, in the settler colonies, you see large European populations living among even more numerous indigenous peoples and continuously clashing over resources as well as social or cultural differences. In all cases, these labor shortages, with the disappearance of slavery, will lead to inter-regional migration as people migrate from colony to colony within a single European country's empire. It will also lead to increased mineral extraction and deforestation. Regardless, we see that despite having no more African slaves, European wealth is still dependent on non-free labor, right? We switched from serfdom to African slaves to now the exploitation of native peoples in foreign colonies. So come up with your own examples, see if you can remember them. It's important that you know some of these colonies and you know which colonies go with which countries. Okay, so let's talk about some of our motivations and how this is done. So colonialism is a policy by which a nation governs a foreign territory and develops its resources for the benefit of the colonial power. Europeans are really going to exploit long-standing ethnic and cultural divisions between peoples in the colonies. So a great example of this is Rwanda, right? Rwanda, which you all probably know of primarily because of their genocide in the 1990s, right? Well, the Hutus and the Tutsis are two ethnic groups that had clashed in the past. Well, when the British arrive, they are going to favor the Tutsis, the minority group, over the Hutus, right? They are going to purposefully sort of fan the flames of this rivalry. Because if your indigenous peoples are so busy fighting each other, they're not going to be able to unite and organize to fight against you. Europeans will live mainly in the capital cities of these colonies and will have the day-to-day administration of the colonies handled by locals. Women will not be involved in the early stages of colonialism, but once European women do start to arrive, it will lead to increased racial segregation. All right. In general, we see that Europeans will arrive with some positive motivations, right? They want to educate, they want to help, whatever. However, they will purposefully limit their help because they don't actually want their colonies to become developed, right? They don't want the people in the colonies to have the resources and the know-how to realize like, hey, this is a bad deal we're getting. So European colonial policies will purposefully stunt the growth of a middle class in the colonies. They want to keep a huge social wealth divide. So one of the motivations and ideologies at play here is something called social Darwinism. So social Darwinism is the application of Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection to justify European conquest of non-Western societies. All right, so Charles Darwin and his theory of natural selection is essentially survival of the fittest, right? The strongest, the best camouflaged, the, best resource finder, I don't know, the survival of the fittest, right? The animal who survives to evolve to our day and age has done so because its features have allowed it to survive where others have failed, right? So a frog whose spots help it hide in the water will not get eaten, whereas a frog that's neon pink will get eaten. So the spotted frog will be able to live and reproduce, and thus you will have baby spotted frogs, right? Whereas the pink frog got eaten, no frog babies. All right. So how does this apply then to society? Well, this is, of course, a misapplication of this idea. But social Darwinism says, like, hey, survival of the fittest also applies to society, right? Those who are rich, those who are in power because they deserve to be so, right? They are more clever. They are better suited for their position of power. Whereas the poor sort of deserve to be poor. If they were better suited, survival of the fittest, they would be in that position. Because they are not suited to power and wealth, then they don't have it. Similarly, why are European states, white states, so dominant? Why do we have such superior technology? Well, it's because we are the smartest. We are the best resourced. We deserve it, right? Survival of the fittest has said that the Europeans deserve to be in power, whereas all these other states don't. And so, it's nothing personal. It's survival of the fittest, and Europeans are the best. So tough luck. Europeans will use this. It's a terrible theory, right? Like, it's super racist. It is completely self-aggrandizing, but it will help justify Europe's actions around the world. Why they choose not to educate the indigenous populations. Why their actions are purposefully cruel. Well, the people can't handle it, right? There's no point in educating them. They won't be able to understand democracy. It will also help Europeans justify why they segregate themselves, right? They're not going to mix with the natives. And in fact, they will pass laws to keep mixing to a minimum, right? Until really the 1990s. And later in South Africa, it was illegal for blacks and whites to be in relationships together. Interracial marriage was illegal. It was illegal in the United States until the mid-20th century. So white racial supremacy was widely accepted. And it's going to help motivate and color all sort of white interactions on a political, economic, and social scale. So here's a primary source. Two primary sources, in fact. You have the poem, The White Man's Burden, by Rupert Kipling. This is a really famous poem. You'll hear it referenced often, even if all you hear is the white man's burden. I need you to know what this is referencing. A separate primary source is this image. Let's see, I think I have the entire image here. Yes. So, the white man's burden. Take up the white man's burden. Send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile to serve your captives' need, to wait with heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new caught sullen peoples, half devil, half child. Right? So Rupert Kipling, who's, you may know him because he wrote the Jungle Book, right? This poem goes on. It has multiple stanzas. But this is often serves as a shorthand to talk about the racial motivation of Europeans, right? The white man's burden is to try and go forth to the rest of the world and bring civilization, bring culture to all of these other peoples. And you won't really be able to, because they are half devil, half child. They lack the maturity. They lack, blah, 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 right? Again, you see these social Darwinist, racist ideas being perpetuated in culture, right? In literature. This is a poem. Or look at this political cartoon, right? You have Britain represented right here. You have America represented right here. And who are they carrying on their backs, right? See, many of the people are labeled, but they're also caricatures, right? This is an incredibly racist image. This is, the name of this is The White Man's Burden, right? And so the United States and Britain are carrying the rest of the world, these barbarous, half devil, half child people across ignorance, vice, brutality, superstition, to eventually civilization. So take a moment, pause, and check in with your own learning. What's social Darwinism? And how does it relate to imperialism? What assumptions did Europeans make about non-whites? And why did Europeans believe their civilizing of natives was beneficial? This is a great video of Trevor Noah. So if you don't know who Trevor Noah is, he is the host of The Daily Show, but he is from South Africa and is biracial. So the name of his memoir is in fact Born a Crime, because his father was white, was Swiss, and his mother is African. So he talks about his experience in that culture, and a little bit about colonization. It's pretty funny. We're not doing that. Watch this video, please. So even if you don't watch it today, you need to watch it this unit, and I need you to watch the entire thing. All right, so this era, what we're talking about here is new imperialism, right? Old imperialism is the colonization of the Americas. So there are political motives, cultural motives, and economic motives for this new imperialism. Political motives are straightforward. The more land you control, the more powerful you are, right? It adds to your prestige. You might have heard the phrase, the sun never sets on the British Empire. That's because Britain had colonies all around the world, so it was daytime. So colonial officers in countries would choose to expand into new territory just to make sure their country got there first. It wasn't even, we want this land. It's, we just don't want the other guy. We don't want Germany. We don't want France to get this land. So we're going to take it. Again, a lot of these political motivations have nothing to do with Africa or Asia, and have everything to do with the internal European rivalries. And it will erupt in World War I. You also have cultural motivations. So you have new racial ideologies like social Darwinism. You also have Christian evangelism, right? So part of this will include missionaries. Now, in our first wave of imperialism, the missionaries were primarily Jesuits, right? They were Catholics. Now you're going to see a lot of Protestant missionaries. So it's important to put an asterisk by our talk of missionaries, because missionaries accompanied the economic and political motivations, but were not necessarily 100% in line with them. They were separate organizations and entities. So many missionaries went with the express purpose of serving as doctors, right? Or nurses, to teach about Jesus, but to not necessarily, but to also learn about the native peoples. So you have instances of missionaries doing, terrible things, but also lots of instances of missionaries going out to, just live out their faith. So the conflict often emerged was many missionaries, Catholic and Protestant, would want to convert the cultural behavior of the people they were evangelizing to, as well as their religious views. So some of it makes sense, right? You would run into some of this conflict with Islam as well. If part of your culture was, I'm going to eat a lot of pork, right? If you were converting to Islam, they would be like, ooh, you need to cut that, like you can't do that anymore. Similarly, if you're going to convert to Christianity, they're going to say you can't be polygamous anymore. You need to, part of being a Christian, Catholic or Protestant, is only having one spouse. So some of it makes sense. Some of it, though, is unnecessary. Like, why do you need to wear shoes, right? Why do you need to wear European style clothing? It's hot, it's stuffy. There's no reason, there's nothing in the Bible that says you need to be wearing petticoats and a shirt and a jacket and a tie. So there was often a rub there because along with religious views being communicated, there was also cultural values being communicated. Missionaries would often be the ones to open schools and educate indigenous populations. In fact, it's missionaries that have helped preserve some indigenous languages because they want to translate it into the Bible. And so they help create a literary tradition to a language so then they can translate it. You also have medicine, hygiene being taught to indigenous populations. So this is really where we see women getting involved with the colonial movement. Women would serve as missionaries, as nurses, and as teachers. And their participation really called attention to maternal and women's health issues. Things like the problem of child marriage, or how many women were dying in childbirth. So they would campaign against child marriage or the practice of sati. Remember, sati is when a widow has to commit suicide by throwing her body on the funeral pyre, right? Suicide by burning to death. Female missionaries were like, this is bad. This is a bad idea. We should stop this. Like, this should be illegal. As well as the practice of killing twins in Africa. Women would also, female missionaries and nurses would really campaign against these practices, seeking to have laws passed and then enforced to stop these practices. So the consequence of all of these things will be increased nationalism among the Europeans, because they're really seeing themselves as like, we're heroes, right? We look like we're so strong. We have all of this land around the world, and we're civilizing the natives, right? That's social Darwinism. But of course, of the three motivations, political, cultural, and economic, the number one motivation is going to be economic. So industrialization caused demand for new materials. You need copper for wiring, tin for creating cans, chrome and manganese for steel, coal for steam engines, gold and diamonds just because they're pretty. This increased urbanization will mean there's an increased need to import crops as well. Remember, we have a huge population boom. So you have demand for crops like corn and wheat, but also you have demand for crops for industries, things like cotton, rubber, sugar, coffee, tea, tobacco. And the unreliable nature of laissez-faire economics means there's lots of booms and busts, right? You make it big and then you lose everything. There's lots of economic depressions in the 19th century. So business leaders want to secure a source of resources and will put pressure on governments to take territory to ensure that they have control. So what were the methods of extraction? Well, we see that Africans will be forced to labor as miners and on plantations, long hours, extremely low wages. Technically, they're not slaves, but basically they're slaves. In the Belgian Congo, we really see rubber being the main crop. In West and Central Africa, it's really going to be palm oil because it's going to be used to lubricate the machines to make sure that they function well. Roads and railways will be built to move raw materials to port. So that means infrastructure. Europeans will build up infrastructure in these new colonies. But the infrastructure is not designed to increase the movement of people. It's designed to exploit the environment and thus is not very useful. The European colonial governments will also impose tax systems on their colonies, which had to be paid in cash or cash crops. This forced free Africans to work for the colonists as well. So raw materials are coming from the colonies and then being sent to Europe to be manufactured. So how did they do this? Well, industrial change justified colonial possessions and made them easier to acquire. And you're going to have new weapons to help you. A machine gun, the repeating rifle will make Europeans basically impossible to stop in Africa and Pacific Islands. You are also going to have steamships, which will allow you to get to the interior of Africa. One of the reasons why Africa hasn't been colonized in the past was simply its geography. Its rivers ran from Central Africa to the ocean, and the jungles were too dense to go upstream. But with a steamboat, you can do that. So you'll use steamboats outfitted with machine guns. You have a variety of native responses. You have traditional tactics, invoking of ancestral spirits, shamans. You have diplomacy, African kings and diplomats just trying to cut deals with these invaders. And then, of course, you have violence. Guerrilla tactics will be used to stall European advances, but will never be able to prevent it. The brief exception to this will be the Zulu victory over the British in 1879. And we'll talk about that when we go into depth about South Africa. We already discussed this discussion question, so let's do some practice questions to finish up our day. The trade patterns shown on the map depict All right, here's a source. You might need to pause your video to read it. Okay, this text would probably have been used to the text clearly shows the influence of during the period 1800 to 1900, this ideology was most directly applied to which of the following regions? Explain how ideologies contributed to the development of imperialism from 1750 to 1900. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions, please ask. Have a great day.